The heat of the Egyptian afternoon is breaking. A Hebrew slave stands in the doorway of his mud brick home in the district of Goshen. Listen to the command in Exodus chapter 12. Verse 4. If any household is too small for a whole lamb, pour it out at their feet, with the blood applied. The families retreated into the house and shut the door against the approaching darkness. The judgment was sealed outside. Inside, they finally had to eat the meat of the lamb they had watched and inspected for 4 days, but they were not allowed to sit down and find comfort. Before they took a single bite, God handed them a very strange dress code. The heavy wooden door is finally shut. Outside, the Egyptian night is descending, bringing with it a terror no one can fully comprehend. But inside, the air is thick with the smoke of roasting meat. The two families, the host and the neighbor, stand around the fire. They are safe. They are covered by the blood at the threshold. But God does not allow them to relax. If you have just survived a divine judgment, you might expect to sit down, recline, and celebrate. In the ancient Near East, a feast of covenant or deliverance was meant to be eaten in a posture of rest. You take off your sandals, you wash your feet, you recline at the table. But the instructions for the first Passover completely subvert this expectation. Listen to the command in Exodus chapter 12. Verse 11. This is how you are to eat it, with your cloak tucked into your belt. They must share one with their nearest neighbor, having taken into account the number of people there are. Your sandals on your feet and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. This is a posture of intense, immediate readiness. The belt is fastened, so a long tunic will not trip them when they run. The sandals, usually left at the door, are laced tightly to their feet. The walking staff is not resting against the wall. It is gripped in their hands while they chew. They are standing in a mud brick house they have inhabited for generations. The Egyptian guards are still at their posts. The empire has not yet surrendered. Physically, they are still slaves. But structurally, everything has shifted. They are eating a meal of freedom while still standing inside a prison. Faith is not always the absence of fear. Often, it is the physical posture you assume while the fear is still present. God is demanding that they act out their liberation before the door even opens, and they are not doing it alone. Look around that small, smoke-filled room. The father looks at the neighbor he invited inside just a few days ago. They are both holding staffs. They are both wearing sandals. They are both chewing the same roasted meat. The shared meal cements the shared departure. When the morning comes, they will not walk out of Goshen as competing individuals. They will walk out as one people, sustained by one lamb. You are to determine the amount of lamb needed in accordance with what each person will eat. The instruction is painstakingly practical. This was never meant to be a one-time event. God commanded the Israelites to recreate this exact meal every single year, for generations. They would select a lamb on the 10th of Nisan. They would inspect it for 4 days. They would sacrifice it on the 14th. They would gather their households. And if they were too small, they would invite the neighbors. The Passover became the rhythmic heartbeat of the biblical community. It was a yearly reminder that salvation requires a flawless sacrifice, and that you cannot consume that sacrifice in isolation. But the pattern was not just a memorial of the past. It was a countdown. For over 1,000 years, the blood was applied, the meat was shared, and the families waited. The ritual echoed through the centuries, pointing toward a final, ultimate fulfillment. And then, during one particular spring in the 1st century, the calendar aligned perfectly again in the streets of Jerusalem. Spring in the 1st century. The stone streets of Jerusalem are choked with dust and pilgrims. The population of the city has swelled to several times its normal size for the approaching festival. It is the 10th day of the month of Nisan. Everywhere you look, families are purchasing sheep. According to the ancient command given in the mud of Egypt, a 1st century Passover lamb was a significant animal, often yielding enough meat to comfortably feed between 15 and 20 people. Today is the day the Passover lambs must be selected and brought into the homes. And on this exact day, a man rides down the Mount of Olives on the back of a donkey, surrounded by a screaming crowd. We call it Palm Sunday, but the ancient biblical calendar calls it Selection Day. As thousands of fathers are leading animals across their thresholds to begin the 4-day wait, Jesus enters the city. But he does not go to a private residence. He goes directly into the temple, his father's house. For 1,000 years, the Israelites had faithfully practiced the 4-day inspection, examining their animals for a hidden limp or a physical defect. Now, the true lamb has entered the house, and the final, ultimate inspection begins. For the next 4 days, Jesus does not retreat to the safety of the countryside. He stands in the center of the temple courts, the most public and highly contested space in the ancient world. From the 10th to the 14th of Nisan, he is relentlessly examined by the religious and political authorities. The Pharisees approach him to test his theology. The Sadducees challenge his understanding of the resurrection. The Herodians try to trap him regarding his political loyalty to Rome. A small, fragmented family of 3 or 4 could not possibly consume it all before morning, and God strictly forbade leaving any of the meat until sunrise. They question his authority, his teaching, and his origins. They are not just debating a controversial rabbi. Prophetically, they are inspecting the sacrifice. They are searching for a flaw. They are looking for a moral, theological, or legal blemish that would disqualify him. But they find nothing. Even when he is betrayed in the dark and dragged before the authorities of the Roman Empire, the inspection continues. Pontius Pilate interrogates him in the praetorium. He examines him under the full weight and scrutiny of Roman law. Finally, Pilate walks out to the hostile crowd, stands at his own threshold, and announces the official result of the inspection: "I find no fault in him. The lamb is proven flawless." And so, on the 14th day of Nisan, as the afternoon sun begins to fall, the ancient pattern reaches its violent conclusion. At the exact time the priests in the temple are slaughtering the Passover lambs for the nation, the true lamb is bleeding out on a Roman cross just outside the city walls. The timing is not a coincidence. It is divine architecture. The blueprint designed in the slave camps of Goshen is perfectly executed on the hill of Golgotha. Jesus perfectly fulfills the 10th day selection, the 4-day inspection, and the 14th day sacrifice. He provides the blood that allows. Therefore, a small family faced a structural problem. They could not simply secure their own salvation, paint their own doorpost, the judgment of God to pass over humanity. But a crucial piece of the Exodus story still remains. What about the household? What about the communal math that forced the isolated slaves to invite their neighbors inside? Jesus did not just come to die to save isolated individuals. He came to form a new people, to see how he fulfills the social command of the Passover. We have to look closely at the meal he hosted in the upper room. When Jesus takes the bread and the cup, he does not just follow the ancient liturgy. He completely redefines who belongs at the table. The upper room is quiet. The streets outside are thick with pilgrims. But inside, the air is heavy with anticipation. 13 men are reclining around a low table. If you look closely at who is in the room, you realize that the communal math of Egypt is happening again. Sitting at this table is Matthew, a former tax collector, who made his living collaborating with the Roman Empire. Sitting near him is Simon the Zealot, a man whose political ideology demanded the violent overthrow of Rome. In any other setting, they are enemies. In any other house, they would never share a meal. But tonight, they are not defined by their politics. Lock the world out and hide in the dark. The divine command forced them outward. The father of a small household had to step out of his door. Their pasts, or their social standing. They have been drawn into the same room because they have been invited by the same host. As the meal progresses, Jesus takes the unleavened bread, he breaks it, hands it to his disciples, and says, "This is my body given for you." Later, he takes the cup and calls it the new covenant in his blood. By taking the elements of the Passover and applying them to himself, Jesus is making a staggering claim. He is not just replacing the animal. He is reconstituting the household. The blood on the threshold of the cross will save them from the ultimate empire of sin and death. But the shared meal will bind them together, into a new family. The early Christians understood this perfectly. Decades later, The Apostle Paul writes to a divided, fractured church in the city of Corinth. The Corinthians are fighting over social status, spiritual gifts, and theology. They have brought the competitive, hierarchical mindset of the Roman Empire straight into the church. To correct them, Paul does not give them a list of behavioral rules. He takes them back to the Passover. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, he writes, "For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed." And then, in chapter 10, he explains how this shared sacrifice forces them together, because there is one loaf. We, who are many, are one body, for we all share the one loaf. Cross the dirt street, approach the threshold of his nearest neighbor, and invite them inside. They had to merge their households. This is the ultimate fulfillment of the math in Exodus 12. In Egypt, the households had to merge if they were too small to consume the lamb. In the New Covenant, the humanity itself is too weak and fragmented to survive alone. So God takes Jews and Gentiles, slaves and free, rich and poor, and forces them across the threshold into a single, global household. We are made into one body strictly because we all share the one lamb. In the ancient world, to eat from the same sacrifice was to become family. The blood on the doorpost of the cross changes our legal status with God. It protects us from judgment. But sharing the broken bread changes our status with each other. It removes our right to view the person sitting next to us as a stranger or a competitor. This historical and theological pattern is beautiful. It is the architectural blueprint of the gospel. But the moment we move from history to reality, the pattern becomes deeply uncomfortable. It directly confronts how we practice faith today. The truth is, modern believers love the blood of the Lamb, but we are often terrified of the household. We have inherited the sacrifice. But in many ways, we have abandoned the table. We live in an era that has perfected the illusion of the private faith. The modern religious instinct is deeply, fiercely individualistic. We want a personal relationship with a personal Savior. We want the blood painted securely on our own private doorpost. They had to calculate their collective need and share their supply. Why? On the night of the greatest emergency in their history, keeping the chaos and judgment of the world safely on the outside. But when it comes to the actual people who make up the body of Christ, we would prefer to keep the heavy wooden door firmly shut. The objection to community is entirely understandable and often born from real pain. Real biblical community is deeply inconvenient, and it is messy. The people sitting next to us in the local church can be difficult, flawed, or simply exhausting. Many have experienced genuine hurt within religious spaces, making the desire to retreat not just a preference, but a survival tactic. After a long week of surviving the pressures of modern life, it is much easier to listen to a sermon through headphones, read a devotion in isolation, and avoid the friction of other human beings. We often ask a quiet, protective question. Is the church actually necessary? Can I not just follow Jesus entirely on my own? But the divine math of Exodus 12 refuses to allow this. If an Israelite father in Egypt had tried to slaughter the animal, take a small portion of meat into a dark corner, and consume it by himself, he would have been directly violating the command of God. The sacrifice was structurally designed to be too large for an isolated life. It forced him into mutual dependence. You cannot consume the lamb alone. Biblical salvation never leaves you as an isolated individual. Why was God so concerned about the exact ratio of meat to people? Why not simply command them to slaughter a smaller animal, holding a private ticket to the next life? It always places you into a demanding, protective, and shared family. This is where the text confronts our modern habits. What are you trying to control by keeping your faith isolated? What have you mistaken for mature faith, when it is actually just a sophisticated desire to remain undisturbed? When you avoid the friction of the community, you are actively protecting the habits of the empire. You are maintaining the exact mindset of the Egyptian slave camp, a worldview that says everyone is a competitor. Emotional resources are scarce, and no one outside your immediate walls can truly be trusted. God uses the awkward, frustrating reality of the shared table to remove the empire from our hearts. The friction of dealing with a difficult neighbor is the exact mechanism that produces endurance. The necessity of sharing burdens is what destroys our inherent greed. The act of sitting at the Lord's table with someone you would normally avoid, someone who is covered by the exact same blood, is the only thing powerful enough to dismantle human pride. We want the spiritual benefits of the cross, but we resist the communal demands of the bread. He looks at his wife, his young son, and his daughter. Then he looks at the young animal tied nearby. He is doing a calculation in his head, or allow them to discard the leftovers. The familiar interpretation of Passover is that it was simply a mechanism to protect an individual family from death. Yet the pattern remains unbroken. The lamb always creates a household. You cannot have the sacrifice without the table. You cannot claim the protection of the blood while refusing to sit with the family. But stepping out of our curated isolation and into this shared reality is terrifying. When you have spent a lifetime surviving alone, how do you actually begin to merge your household? The answer brings us right back to the mud brick streets of Goshen, to the very first physical image of this story. Step back and look at the vast, intricate architecture of this story. For centuries, we have reduced the Passover to a simple, frantic night of terror and escape. But the divine pattern reveals a blueprint that is infinitely more beautiful. The command to select the lamb on the 10th day, the 4-day period of careful domestic inspection, the pooling of the blood on the threshold, and the shared meal eaten in a posture of immediate readiness. None of this was accidental. It was a carefully designed mechanism of restoration. God was systematically dismantling the psychology of the empire. The math of the Passover, fulfilled perfectly in the final inspection and sacrifice of Jesus Christ, demands that the cross must always lead to the table. Christ did not merely die to secure our individual survival. He died to forge a new humanity. But this overlooked detail reveals something entirely different. The very first instruction of the Exodus is not about moving geographically. It is about connecting socially. We are not just saved from the judgment of our own Egypt, we are saved from the agonizing loneliness of it. This changes how we must view our own salvation. The central question of the Passover is not just whether you are personally covered by the blood. The deeper question is who you have invited into the house to share the supply. Return to that opening image. The heat of the Egyptian afternoon is breaking. A father stands at his door in the mud brick district of Goshen, calculating the size of his family, and realizing they are too small to consume the lamb alone. For 400 years, that doorway had been a defensive barrier. It was the place where he locked away his meager supplies, shut out the hostile overseers, and hid from the fractured, competing slaves living right next door. The threshold was a boundary of fear, designed to keep a dangerous world at a distance. But as the sun sets on the 14th of Nisan, that doorway is permanently transformed. When the blood of the unblemished lamb is struck against the frame, pooling at the SAF, it becomes an altar. The door is no longer a barrier designed to keep death out. It becomes an open entrance, inviting the vulnerable neighbor in. The blood on the outside proves that the judgment of God has passed over them. But the shared meal on the inside proves this is not ultimately a story about an individual escaping a crisis. It is a story about a fractured people learning how to belong to one another. That the empire of Egypt has finally been broken. They did not just survive the terror of the night as isolated individuals. They became a family, bound together by a sacrifice they could never have provided on their own. This is the ultimate invitation of the true Passover. Christ, our unblemished Lamb, has been sacrificed at the threshold of the world. He endured the fierce inspection of the religious elite. He shed his blood on the Roman cross. And he broke the bread for a new covenant. He has provided everything required for our deliverance, but he leaves the communal math of the household to us. Look at your own life. Look at the protective walls you have built to survive your own exhaustion. Look at the people standing right outside your door, carrying their own hidden burdens, desperate for a place to truly belong. You do not have to possess perfect strength or a flawless history to invite them in. You only have to possess the same sacrifice. This is not ultimately a story about an individual escaping the dark. It is a story about a shattered people learning how to belong to one another again. The Lamb has already been slain. The judgment has already passed. It is time to open the door, through a shared sacrifice. Before they took a single step out of Egypt, God was forcing them to look at the vulnerable people living right next door. They were about to become a nation. But at this exact moment, they were just exhausted. Isolated families trying to survive the week. To understand why this communal math was so essential to their spiritual survival, we have to step back. We have to look at the psychological damage they were carrying, and understand what 4 centuries of the Egyptian Empire had actually done to the minds of the Hebrew slaves. The mud of the Nile Delta is heavy. When mixed with straw and baked under the Egyptian sun, it forms bricks that can withstand centuries. For 400 years, the descendants of Abraham had been forced to pull that mud, cut that straw, and build the vast store cities of Pithom and Ramesses. We often read the early chapters of Exodus as a story about a unified nation crying out to God for deliverance. But that is a later theological projection. He has just received a message that will alter the course of human history. But right now, he is doing math. Historically, the Hebrews living in the district of Goshen were not a cohesive nation. They were a fractured, traumatized collection of surviving families. Generations of systemic slavery do not merely break the human back, they break the human community. The psychology of an empire is designed to isolate the individual. When your daily survival depends on meeting a ruthless quota of bricks, the person working next to you is no longer your brother. He is your competitor. If he falls in the mud, and you stop to help him, the overseer's whip falls on your own shoulders. You learn to look down. You learn to hoard whatever small scraps of food you can find. You learn to close your door at night and trust no one outside your immediate walls. This was the internal condition of the Israelites on the eve of the Passover. 4 centuries of brutal oppression had conditioned them to view everyone, even their own people, with suspicion. The empire had stripped away their shared ancestral identity and replaced it with a desperate, solitary will to survive. This historical reality changes how we view the command to merge households. God was not merely performing a logistical census or preventing food waste. He was directly confronting the psychological damage of Egypt. If God had simply destroyed the Egyptian army and opened the borders, the Israelites would have marched into the wilderness as a million isolated refugees. Most readers know the broad strokes of the first Passover. It is the defining historical moment of the Old Testament. The 10th plague is approaching. They would have carried the brutal, self-serving habits of the slave camps out into the desert. Without a shared identity, the moment the water ran out, they would have turned on each other. You can remove a man from a prison in an instant, but it takes a profound intervention to remove the prison from the man. The physical chains were about to be broken by the 10th plague, but the social chains had to be broken at the dinner table. By forcing the smaller, more vulnerable households to walk across the street and ask for help, God was forcing them to look their neighbors in the eye. He was compelling them to lower their defenses. Imagine the friction of that moment. A man who has spent his entire life competing with the family next door must now stand at their threshold. He must admit his own household is too small or too weak to consume the lamb alone. He must ask to share their fire, their space, and their sacrifice. This was the divine mechanism of restoration. God was binding them to one another through mutual need. He was taking a scattered collection of survivors and fusing them into a community. But rebuilding a shattered people takes more than a sudden, chaotic meal. A defensive mindset forged over 400 years cannot be erased in a single afternoon. The people needed time to prepare, not just for the journey. The angel of death is preparing to sweep through the streets of the greatest empire on earth. The Israelites are commanded to take a lamb, but to understand the gravity of the sacrifice that would cover them, God was about to bring them out. But releasing them physically without fixing them, communally, would be a disaster. That is why the first phase of the rescue could not happen overnight. It required a very specific, agonizing timeline. The timeline of the Exodus is exactly as specific as the math. God did not simply announce the 10th plague and tell the Israelites to immediately slaughter an animal. He imposed a delay. According to Exodus chapter 12, on the 10th day of the month of Nisan, the head of the household was commanded to select a 1-year-old male lamb or young goat. But the sacrifice was not to be made on that day. Verse 6 gives a precise instruction: take care of them until the 14th day of the month, when all the members of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight, 4 days. For 96 hours, the selected animal was not merely marked and left out in the field. Ancient Jewish tradition, along with the practical reality of protecting an unblemished animal in a crowded slave district, meant it was brought close. It was brought into the domestic space. Imagine the sensory shift inside those small mud brick homes. The Israelites were shepherds by trade, but their flocks were kept outside in pens and pastures. Now, a living, the breathing creature is brought across the threshold. Sacrifice it, and paint its blood on the wooden frames of their doors. The blood will act as a divine shield. The judgment will pass over. For 4 days, the family hears its hooves moving against the dirt floor. They smell its wool. The children inevitably touch it, feed it, and watch it sleep. The vulnerable neighbor who will be sharing the meal likely comes over to see the animal, confirming that it is sufficient to cover their combined families. During this waiting period, a profound psychological shift occurs. The animal ceases to be an anonymous unit of livestock. It becomes a specific, recognized presence. It becomes observed. This delay forces the family to live in the tension of what is about to happen. Outside their walls, the plagues have ravaged the Egyptian empire, and the final shadow of death is approaching. Inside their walls, an innocent life is quietly breathing. Every time they look at the lamb, they are reminded that this creature's life will soon be traded for their own. When the 14th day finally arrives, they are not slaughtering a generic sacrifice. They are sacrificing their lamb. The cost of their redemption is no longer an abstract idea. It is standing right in front of them. But this 4-day window was not merely designed to create emotional attachment. It served a strict, ancient, legal purpose. God had commanded that the lamb must be absolutely without blemish. In the ancient Near East, establishing physical perfection was not a quick process. You cannot determine if an animal is truly flawless with a passing glance. The chains of slavery will finally break. We remember it as a night of terror, blood, and sudden, miraculous deliverance. A hidden limp, a concealed sickness, or a respiratory defect might take several days to become fully visible. The 4-day waiting period was a time of intense, deliberate inspection. The family, and the neighbors joining them, had to watch the lamb eat, walk, and rest to guarantee it met the divine standard. It had to be proven flawless under the daily scrutiny of the shared household. Only after the lamb had endured this careful observation could the family proceed. The waiting period created a bond, but it also fulfilled a rigorous spiritual requirement. As the sun began to set on the 14th day, the preparation ended. The moment of judgment arrived, but when the father finally drew the knife, he did not take the animal to a distant religious shrine, and he did not hand it to a professional priest. To understand the true intimacy of this night, we have to look at exactly where the blood fell. Twilight falls on the 14th day of Nisan. The waiting is over. Across the district of Goshen, thousands of fathers step to the front of their homes. The sounds of bleeding animals echo down the dirt streets, followed by a sudden, heavy silence. We are conditioned to think of biblical sacrifice as a clean, highly orchestrated religious event conducted by robed professionals. But on the night of the Passover, there was no temple in Jerusalem. But when you open the book of Exodus and read the actual instructions given to Moses, a strange contradiction emerges. There was no Levitical priesthood. There was only a father, a neighbor, a terrified family, and a lamb The instructions for what happens next are found in Exodus 12:22. Moses tells the elders of Israel to take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood, and strike the lintel and the two side posts of the door. It is a familiar, violent image, but a critical detail regarding exactly where the blood was held is often lost in our modern translations. The English text usually says to dip the hyssop in the blood that is in the basin or bowl. The Hebrew word used here is saf, sf. The translation of basin makes logical sense for holding liquid, but it softens a profound architectural reality. The English word is narrower than the Hebrew expression. In the ancient world, the primary and most common meaning of saf is threshold, the bottom step, seal, or foundation of a doorway. When we look at how the word is used elsewhere in the Old Testament, such as in Ezekiel's vision of the temple gates, saf specifically refers to the physical threshold of a building. This changes the image of the Passover completely. The Israelites did not quietly slaughter the lamb in the backyard and carefully drain its blood into a piece of household pottery. The linguistic and cultural evidence suggests they slaughtered the animal. On the eve of a terrifying cosmic judgment, God seems entirely preoccupied with the logistics of a dinner party. Right at the front door, the blood pooled in the natural depression of the threshold itself. The father took the hyssop, a common, coarse weed, growing in the cracks of the walls, dipped it directly into the threshold, and painted the sides and top of the doorframe. The entire entrance was encompassed by the sacrifice. By slaughtering the lamb at the saf, the doorway of a common mud brick house became an altar. Long before God built a tabernacle in the wilderness, He turned the domestic home into the very first temple. Remember the communal math from the first instruction. The father of the house is not doing this alone. The neighbor he invited inside is standing right beside him. Two men, representing two fractured, exhausted families, are watching the blood pool at the very boundary that used to separate them. In the ancient Near East, the threshold was a boundary of ownership and protection. It was the line where you kept strangers out. Now, it has become the exact place of shared sacrifice. The blood painted on the outside of the door changed their legal status with God. When the final plague swept through Egypt, the judgment would pass over them. But the shared experience of standing together at that bloody threshold changed their status with each other. They were no longer isolated competitors surviving an empire. They were a unified community, covered by the exact same life.